Cool. Cool. We have officially done it. We completed the 47 book challenge as we set out to do so ambitiously. They said I couldn't do it, and I proved the haters wrong. So we will begin with Robert Silverberg. Thorns. Thorns is all right. It's certainly not my favorite Silverberg, although it's one of historically his most important books. It's the one where he stepped into the big boy shoes of being like a new waver instead of just a pulp writer. I've not actually read any pre-Thorns Silverberg. I would assume it's probably not as good as his later stuff. It's about a guy who was part of a team of interstellar explorers who get kidnapped by aliens and tortured and physically altered. He survives, comes back to Earth, essentially a monster. Like his face has been totally restructured and optimized by the aliens. And there's this Rupert Murdoch guy who's evil, who takes an interest in him and tries to turn him into basically a reality TV star, and pairs him with this other person of note who was the center of a scandal around in vitro fertilization. And he kind of tries to smash the two of them together and foment a relationship between them, a relationship that is extremely uncomfortable. And then, I don't know, it's really about this guy trying to come out of his shell and trying to reintegrate back into a society that despises him and fears him, and is simultaneously voyeuristically fascinated by him. This has shades of Unsleeping Eye by Compton, but it's just not as good of a book. I think this is pretty rough on a bunch of fronts, including just in context with Silverberg's other stuff that I think is better than this. Mostly, I think you should read it if you're interested in reading Silverberg's first Silverberg novel. Other than that, I wasn't really into it. Tanith Lee's Don't Bite the Sun, I will give an A. Pretty safe to say that most Tanith Lee books are going to be around an A, with a few S's thrown in there. Lee is kind of like a Silverberg in that if you find one of her books out at a bookshop and it's got a cool cover, chances are it's probably going to be pretty good. She has really, on very, very, very few occasions, ever disappointed me. And she is one of those authors of the time who wrote prolifically and equally competently, both in science fiction and in fantasy. I'm just really, really impressed by Lee almost every time that I read her. This is a good example. This is, I think, not one of her more famous books. It's got the amazing cover that I love, one of my all-time favorite covers, certainly one of my favorite DAW covers. There's something about seeing Tanith Lee on a DAW that just scratches such an itch for me. I cannot resist it. I have a big Tanith Lee collection. In fact, I think I might have more Tanith Lee books than any other author, other than Malzberg. Don't Bite the Sun was written in the 70s. It reads like a book from the 90s about rave kids, like club culture. It's like a ravey sort of City in the Stars by Arthur Clarke. Far future where people live in these domed cities that run on the kind of vibe somehow of its occupants, the majority of whom are people who are well into their 50s, but who biologically are stuck and mentally stuck in this sort of twilight, eternal adolescence where their only job is to revel and do drugs and have sort of romantic flings, and to go into these pods, I think, where the city kind of collects their life force and uses it to fuel the cities. And there's a woman who is curious about what life outside of the cities might be like in this desert sort of landscape. And it's a weird book, and it doesn't all work all the time because she relies pretty heavily on this made-up vocabulary, this vernacular of slang terms that I think definitely gets in the way of the story at times. It can be distracting, and I don't think that I have ever once enjoyed it when a science fiction author did something like this, when they tried to foresee what future slang might be like, or to give it a little bit of credibility and spice, or use it for satire. It is always annoying. I'm not going to give Lee a pass on that front, even though I like Lee, and she would be the one that I would. But it's in there, and it's grit in the old sandals. It's not a turn of phrase. I get sand in my Tivas, and it's annoying, is what I'm saying, and that's what it feels like. The universal experience of being in Mexico and wearing Tivas and getting sand, a little bit of sand in them, and it being annoying enough to you that you would bring it up on one of your videos. I am in Mexico now. Cheers. I'm stealing valor here. This is non-alcoholic beer. So despite the grit in the old sandals, Don't Bite the Sun is a very good book, and it's better than it really should be, given that premise, given the sort of like happy hardcore writing style. It's sort of like Thorns. It's interesting in large part because it feels like a book out of time. It has a sense of prescience, but also it's just a good book. I think that the ending is really good, and it's more meaningful than it really would appear on its surface, because it appears to be a very surface level book, but it is not. Cross of Fire by Barry Malzberg. This is his second to final novel. I know that the remaking of Sigmund Freud is his final one. That's in '83. I think this was from '81 or '82. It's a lot like Destruction of the Temple. It's a lot like Beyond Apollo. It's one of his dystopian books. It's about a guy in a future where there's this soft focus background of tyranny. The protagonist is this depressed guy who, for reasons I don't recall, is administered a treatment by a team of psychologists where they give him the subjective sensory experience of living through the martyrdom of different religious figures throughout history. So he lives as Christ on the cross. He experiences himself being crucified, and so on. And there are like speculative figures from religions from our future and his past. And it's all sort of like muddled up in his own personal life, and he disassociates in his identity, loses track of himself, and it goes just totally off the rails. And I think that it's a commentary about how there's something about like religious fervor, religious zealotry that is very difficult to compartmentalize, and it's very difficult to sort of like digest even in a political order that is completely totalitarian. It's this free radical thing that can't quite be co-opted or ameliorated. As with all Malzbergs, it's a case of, I think you really either like Malzberg or you don't like Malzberg. Even in the hierarchy of Malzberg's books in terms of how known and popular they are, this is towards the bottom of the list. I think even like diehard Malzbergers don't give this one a lot of attention. I just happened to find it at a used bookstore, and I think it's incredible. City of the Singing Flame by Clark Ashton Smith, I will give an A. This made it onto my top 15 fantasy list. I think that it's the best weird fiction that I've read, certainly like the best classic weird fiction. I haven't read much in the new weird, but of the big 3 or 4 of the old weird fiction guys, depending on how you want to rack them, who you want to fit in there, I think that he's the best. His writing is the strongest. I think his writing is stronger than Lovecraft, stronger than Howard. And he benefits from being the least conspicuously bigoted of them. There are moments, but those moments I think are softened by counterbalancing moments that make you feel like, well, maybe he isn't. I see Clark Ashton Smith as being closer to Cordwainer Smith and closer to Jack Vance than to those other two guys or to A. Merritt. And he was, in fact, a big influence on Vance specifically. I don't know if Cordwainer ever cited him. Also, another name that I'll invoke is he reads a lot like Clive Barker at times. I'm not a huge Clive Barker fan, but there are elements of his horror stories that I think are like the razor is sharper with Smith. It's actual horror writing. Tactics of Conquest by Barry Malzberg is actually more unlike the other Malzbergs. There's like a couple of outliers in the Malzberg that I have read. I would say this and Overlay are the two that don't necessarily read like they're kind of following the Malzberg formula. But Tactics of Conquest is notable, I think, because of a couple of reasons. One, the biographical detail behind it. It was originally a story, I don't remember the title of it, but it was originally a short story that actually shows up in another book farther down the list, that one of his editors asked him to beef up into novel length on short notice, and he went on a long weekend and over the course of 4 days fleshed it out into Tactics of Conquest, the novel. And even by Malzberg's own accounting, it was full of padding and filler and stalling for time and talking for the sake of talking. And even so, it's still, I think, one of the funniest, one of the weirdest, and one of the most interesting science fiction books that I've read. And it is kind of recursive. It is kind of metafictional in that there's a very, he doesn't make the comparison super explicitly, but it's pretty obvious that there's a parallel drawn between the satire that he's doing of the professional chess world and of the science fiction publishing and fandom world. It's about these two men. The protagonist is like an unreliable narrator who is delusionally self-confident in his abilities, or in his status as the greatest chess grandmaster on planet Earth, despite having a sort of spotty track record, especially in competition with a childhood friend of his who sits across from him at the chessboard at this chess tournament put on by aliens who have taken them captive and who have put the fate of the universe in their hands. Whoever wins the other half of humanity that their opponent represents will be exterminated. Most of the book is written as pretty straightforward farce and pretty straightforward satire. And then the book ends on this fairly tragic vignette that reframes most of the action of the book and reframes certainly the personalities of the two principal men and turns it into something I think that is much greater than just kind of this sort of like multi-dimensional satire. There's another dimension of it being a genuinely compelling character study and also a commentary about like what psychological factors might drive people in fandoms to take the fandoms way, way too seriously and to become these sort of like delusional, pedantic type people. I think that the ending sort of humanizes it and adds a certain color that elevates it in my eyes, if I'm interpreting it correctly, to be, I think, up there with The Iron Dream in terms of certainly one of the best satires of genre fiction that I've seen, and also just one of the most interesting, weird, sort of like quantumly entangled pieces of satire. I hate to do it to her, but Drinking Sapphire Wine by Tanith Lee, I'm going to put in C tier. This is the sequel to Don't Bite the Sun. It was meant to be the middle book in a trilogy that she never finished. One of the interesting things about Don't Bite the Sun is that it's written from the POV of like a teenager or someone who's mentally a teenager using a bunch of teenager slang, even though it's invented, and still it doesn't read like YA. This one, however, read to me like YA. I found it redundant for the most part with Don't Bite the Sun. It didn't have the same sort of elan. And those annoying parts of Don't Bite the Sun were foregrounded much more, and the character work was not as strong. And I thought that the plot was fairly boring. I just thought that this was sort of unworthy, and I've forgotten most of it, but I do remember there's a subplot with a pet. There's like this weird dog. I don't remember if it's a robot or if... No, it's some like bespoke, genetically engineered pet thing that takes up just this huge chunk of the book and kind of goes nowhere. There's a bunch of like sub-stories with this dog creature. This book kind of got on my nerves, which was too bad. It does have a great, I think it's a Don Mates cover. But other than that, I find this skippable. It really didn't add much to the experience of reading Don't Bite the Sun. The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Man, is this good. I won't summarize it because you probably already know the summary. I will say, if you haven't read it or if you've only seen some movie adaptation of it, I absolutely think that it's worth reading. And I think that you will be as surprised as I am by A, how unlike other H.G. Wells stories it is, and B, how very contemporary it does feel. Sort of like the book it's rubbing shoulders with here, it feels extremely not like it was written when it was written. It feels like a horror book that was written maybe in like the 1960s or something. There are body horror parts of it that are far more unsettling than I expected. My interpretation of it while I was reading it was that it was allegory for American chattel slavery. I think potentially it's an accidental parallel, accidental symmetry, but I think that it operates possibly accidentally again, flawlessly on that metaphorical level. It is also a refutation of, I guess, the Christian view of the origin of life. It's sort of like Frankenstein. It's one of the early books grappling with this notion of human being as new creator, or science as new God, or science as replacement for God. I also think that there's a layer of interpretation that it's a commentary about British imperialism and the relationship between imperialist and imperial subject. And I think that reading it on that front, it gets into some interesting territory, some potentially uncomfortable territory. But it's another sort of, I guess, quantum object. I will use that turn of phrase once again. It's a book that I think supports the weight of many different layers of interpretation, even ones that may not have been intended by Wells himself. I still think that I like Time Machine and War of the Worlds a little bit better than Moreau, and I haven't read Invisible Man. But of those big three, it's really a big four, but nobody cares about Invisible Man so much anymore for whatever reason. I guess it's boring, that's what people say. But of those three, Moreau is just right behind those other two, and I think that it probably should be more widely read. It's an interesting one to preface Ballard with because there's a very distinctly Ballardian feel to Moreau above and beyond other Wells books, and Ballard apparently didn't care for Wells's fiction, which is interesting, but I think that the comparison is a valid one. The Drought is his middle disaster book, or the original disaster trilogy, beginning with Wind from Nowhere, and then The Drought, and then The Drowned World. Drowned World is the most famous of those. Drought is a very difficult book. Go figure, it's Ballard. But I think even more than Drowned World, it's sort of the quintessential early Ballard. Or did I? No, there's four. Again, there's a big four of those disasters, because Wind from Nowhere he disavowed. It's not counted in the grand tally. It goes Wind from Nowhere, Drought, is it Drowned World and then Crystal World? I don't know. Anyway, The Drought is like the Crystal World except not boring. It's about a UK that is experiencing desertification, however that word is pronounced, because there's a layer of synthetic polymers from industrial waste that has turned the surface of the ocean into a shell, an impermeable shell, so that like the evaporation cycle is disrupted. There's no more rainfall. This guy lives on a houseboat. He's a middle-aged doctor, go figure, in a Ballard, who is isolated and disaffected, and the lake that he's on is sinking. There's really three books in The Drought that are increasingly bizarre and abstract and surreal, and that's really the word. Ballard was really into surrealist painting, and this is his attempt to write like a Salvador Dali painting, and it creates a weird effect where the plot is difficult to follow. The characters don't behave like characters. They're sort of these like, almost like animatronic sort of strange figures who are sort of wandering around in this wasteland that's full of weird like religious symbolism. There's a bunch of very on the nose sort of like pieces of Christian or like New and Old Testament symbolism, like icons of fish are everywhere, and there's pillars of fire in the desert and stuff. It's extremely weird. There's a middle section that's much sort of like harder SF, sort of realistic climate catastrophe horror story that's really good. And it's all suffused with this moral ambiguity where the character sort of, or at least the protagonist, yearns for his own annihilation in this desert, like yearns for death, yearns for the world to be destroyed. It's a book at the end of the world. It's a truly apocalyptic book. It is dense reading experience, not especially user-friendly, even for Ballard. I think that I would put Drought up there with Crash in terms of the amount of work that the reader is really required to do to kind of get, under the skin. But definitely I think it's worth reading. It is, I would say, my favorite of the early disaster books. I like it more than Drowned World, like it more than Crystal World, like it more certainly than Wind from Nowhere. Which brings us on to Crash. Maybe more than any other book that I have covered, this is a book that is not for everybody. At times, it was not for me. It's one of the most intensely, grotesque, disturbing things I've ever read. I put it up there with Dennis Cooper. It's about these two men who share an erotic fixation with car crashes. And I think it's the most vivid, sort of genuinely terrifying, genuinely unnerving, and also genuinely profound analyses of the role, like the human response to technology. Allegedly, science fiction is a fiction of how the human experience is altered by our exposure to new technologies. And I don't think that there is a higher watermark than Crash in terms of saying something about that. This is certainly a controversial book. It was at the time. It precipitated a big sort of moral outrage in the UK upon its publication. It's just a really hard book. And the reading experience is punishing on a couple of fronts. One, just how disturbing it is, and two, its structure of just being sort of like this snake eating its own tail. And as the book progresses and as it just splinters into these repeating vignettes of increasing intensity of these scenes of sexual arousal around car crashes. I don't actually have a big appetite for transgressive fiction or stuff that is as violent as Crash is. I just don't think that there's another book that does what Crash does as well as Crash does it, of saying human consciousness is just entirely permeable and there is essentially no boundary between our internal world and the technology and media-driven world outside of it. Waystation by Simak, I will give a C. I just didn't care for it that much. It's arguably his most popular book, actually. It's probably more widely read than City, I get the impression. I don't think that it's as good as City or as interesting as City. It's about a guy who lives in a barn in West Virginia, I think somewhere out in the sticks. He's visited by an alien who gives him the job or offers him the job of being the keeper for a way station in this intergalactic pseudo-teleportation network. So this guy, while he's inside of his barn, cannot age, time moves differently, and he lives forever or functionally forever, and he collects these alien artifacts and meets all these weird alien creatures, and then the locals get a whiff of something strange afoot and make posses. And I don't know, I found this overly sort of purple in places, I guess, or really, really saccharinely sentimental. And I found it a little bit predictable, and I hate to say it, but I found it slightly dated. I know that that's pretty rich for old book pill to say, but there's certain parts of science fiction, like this older science fiction, that feels extremely, extremely sort of moribund, sort of locked into its particular time in a way that sort of limits it. I think that this is an example of that. Furthest by Suzette, Haden, Elgin. I don't know. Yeah, I'll give it a B. It's a lot like The Two of Us. The Two of Them, The Two of Us by Joanna Russ. Russ based that book on the second book in this series. Furthest is arguably the first, possibly the second. There was a collection of short stories that took place in the Coyote Jones series. I don't remember if it has a different name, but that's the name of the protagonist. But Furthest is the first real novel, and it's also Elgin's first. It's a really decent piece of feminist science fiction about Coyote Jones, an emissary for this intergalactic sort of United Nations, or like a spy for them, I think, who goes to this planet called Furthest. That's the most distal member planet in this sort of United Planets, whatever it's called. And the leadership of this organization changes hands just by lottery system. Every so many years, one of the planets will get to elect a leader. But nobody knows anything about Furthest, who's next up. The culture is not understood, so Coyote Jones goes to Furthest to infiltrate and to study. Furthest is technologically sort of a backwater, and the culture is very patriarchal, and Coyote Jones is asked by a local girl for help in sort of like a family drama or like a legal trouble. It's like a more sort of reader-friendly Joanna Russ. Destruction of the Temple will sit right here next to Crash, probably where it belongs. This is, if I had to name a Malzberg as like the best Malzberg, it would probably be Destruction of the Temple. It's like a cross between Cross of Fire and Crash. It has very strong flavors of both. Structurally, it resembles Cross of Fire very much, which will mean nothing to you because you haven't read it, because nobody's read it. But based on my description, it's about a guy who's a student, like a sociology student, who lives in this dystopian future where New York City has been walled off, and a certain, I don't want to spoil anything, but for like certain dark political motivations to ostracize and to contain a certain like political cohort or like social cohort, I will say. He asks for a commission from his university to fund a project where he goes into the city to reenact JFK's assassination with local people standing in as actors to study this seminal moment in American history. Things immediately start going wrong. He's kidnapped by the locals. They hook him up to this torture machine that forces him to experience episodes of political violence throughout American history. And in very large part, it's racial violence. It's sort of a retrospective on the Jim Crow era and civil rights. And it's just incredibly bizarre. I think it's the weirdest Malzberg, which is really saying something. I think it's also probably the darkest and the angriest. It's like a spiritual biography of a country losing its mind. Extremely hard book to describe. It's actually probably even harder to nutshell than Crash is. Okay, I read Wind from Nowhere. Solid C tier. Ballard called it hack work, and he disowned the book, and I believe tried to suppress its publication or reprinting. It is his first official novel, and certainly his worst. There are hints of the Ballard to come, but not many, and it's this weird sort of mashup of climate disaster and like almost made-for-TV James Bond hero villain weird bullshit. It's not super great, but there is enough in there to kind of make it worth reading. I don't know. I think it's like to be read as a curiosity after reading other Ballard if you like Ballard. Or if you hate Ballard and you like airport thrillers and for some reason you want to read Ballard still, then read this one. It's about what if there was a massive windstorm that never abated, never stopped picking up speed, that just rotated the entire world, destroying everything in its path. What would that world look like? There's some interesting sort of like political satire or commentary, I guess, in that the third world, as it was called at the time, just got completely flattened immediately, and the fortress world of Western Europe looks on with mostly indifference until the wind comes for them too. There are certainly parts of it, I think, that elevate it above being just a sort of period airport thriller, but there are times when it certainly feels like it's just that and not a whole lot more. Space Chantey by Lafferty, I'll give a B, which kind of hurts because I like Lafferty. This is his play on space opera and Golden Age science fiction. In many senses and in many parts, it's pretty funny. And it is also written with the Laffertian, I guess I will say, bombast of just like following his own whatever structure, being very unpredictable, going to intensely bizarre places. Unfortunately, I don't remember a ton about this because I feel like the joke is slightly like overstated, or it's really like this premise of what if Star Trek was the Odyssey? Like, what if Star Trek was the Odyssey, and what if all the crew members on the Enterprise were these backstabbing, like selfish assholes, and there was no inter-crew unity, and everybody was kind of out for their own interests. It is a funny premise, and it is an interesting premise, and it's not like it's a bad book, but I don't remember exactly why, but I found this book boring after like the first half or so. Like all the other Laffertys, except for probably Pastmaster, I'm guessing it's sort of hard to find, but if you can get a copy, if you find one out at a thrift store or at a bookstore and it's reasonably priced, I think it's worth the time. It's certainly not on the level of Pastmaster or Reefs of Earth. The Edge of Running Water by William Sloane is a cosmic horror that I think was from the 1930s, and this is currently available in an NYRB along with To Walk the Night. Those are his two novels that he published during his life. He is best known as a forgotten weird fiction writer, best known for blending a bunch of genres before that was commonly done. His books are horror, cosmic horror, science fiction, they're social novels. Edge of Running Water is the second one. It's fine. It's fine. It's about a mad scientist who lives in a house in the middle of Maine in this small town. The townspeople are weird. An old friend and peer gets a letter from him summoning him out to the house for help running this experiment, dabbling in forces beyond the human ken. And there's a weird lady there who's overbearing. It's all right. It's fine. I don't think it's that great. I don't think I have a ton to say about it. It feels like a Simak book, actually. The other one that is coming up, I liked a little bit more than this one. The Big Sleep by Chandler, I'll give an A. This is hard-boiled noir, the hard-boiled noir other than Maltese Falcon. It's about the seedy underbelly of old Hollywood. Or old LA. A wealthy elderly man in his final days hires a private eye to help extricate him from a blackmail scheme that one of his two daughters got him into by having dealings with pornographers. The private eye goes in and cracks skulls and quips and fast talks and meets all these nefarious characters. The book is very homophobic, go figure. The writing, however, is intensely good, really strong. There's like something about his ability to turn a short sentence that is really good, really hard to describe. I remember him using a lot of simile that just kind of crackled on the page. I can't believe I'm saying that phrase, but there you go. It crackles. The Truth and Other Stories by Stanislaw Lem. It was a mixed bag. There are bits in here that I think are truly astonishing, amazingly prescient, especially stories that he wrote about AI that very, very closely predict the sort of like millenarian AI worship, the sort of like AI theology that's really popular in certain parts of Silicon Valley now, the notion of like we're birthing a new machine god into the universe. And Lem wrote stories along those lines in the 50s. I think I looked it up, and it was like 7 or so years after the first computer had been invented. Lem was already on this tip of like, this specifically is how this is going to destroy the entire universe. The Lem in these stories is a very different Lem than you find in Solaris, who's a very different Lem than you find in Futurological Congress. This is hard science Lem, and it's Lem in short form. I don't think that it's him at his strongest. I didn't connect that well to all the material, but some of it is truly great. These are posthumously translated, most of them. I think only 3 of them had been translated into English previously before this book was published. And I think the book was from 2019 or 2020. So a lot of this material is available in English in this book for the first time. Rogue Moon by Budrys. Yeah, we'll give it a B. Budrys was born to a Lithuanian family, immigrated to the United States either, I can't remember if he immigrated when he was a little kid or he was born in the United States, but strongly identified with his Lithuanian heritage. It's about an alien base that's discovered on the moon, this weird building. People go into it and they immediately are killed. And then they resurrect people via cloning, I think, on a human moon base and then send them back into the building, and they have to map out a very specific trajectory through this carnival funhouse of horrors, moving in particular specific patterns, positioning their bodies in a particular way, or like making certain gestures so that the building doesn't kill them. And the only way to map out this pattern is by just having volunteers go through and die and be resurrected over and over and over and over again. The project is headed by an American scientist who courts a famous daredevil figure with a seeming death wish to be the principal sort of agent, to be the star of the show, to be resurrected, and to be the one to really do the heavy lifting of mapping out this building as sort of the ultimate death-defying stunt in which he dies over and over and over again and preserves the memory of dying as he's resurrected, while his main body, it's the person's body stays on Earth, but they build a new identical copy of them with the same consciousness on the moon, and then it dies, and then somehow the body back on Earth preserves the memory. All this stuff is really sort of in the distant horizon. It's not most of the action of the book. Most of the action of the book is dialogue between these two men, clashing subtly over different sort of modes of leadership, like visions of leadership, visions of what courage is. The scientist has to carry this very heavy burden of being responsible for this project and killing all of these people over and over again. And then the daredevil is grappling with a particular vision of courage, of not caring about death and being this sort of philandering asshole, which the other guy also is, but in a different way. And it's really this character meditation about what death and responsibility mean to these two men. And there's some weird side plots also with love interests and stuff. But the book itself is just a total oddity because it came out in the the late 50s, I think, actually. Published in 1960. There just wasn't very much material like this in American science fiction. To Walk the Night by William Sloane, this is the other one here. I'll put it in B because I found it less boring. It's about these two college students who walk into this room where there's a scientist who is completely immolated in these weird spectral flames and then dies, and then they're sort of the prime suspects in a murder case around this guy. And there's a mysterious woman who was married to the guy who went up in flames, who seems to be capable of prescience, of like psychic prediction of things that will happen in the future. It's a pretty interesting book. I think the ending is really strong. It's another one that's sort of notable because it was this genre-bending, like horror, sci-fi, cosmic horror type thing that had a bit more maturity than I think maybe was typical of this kind of material. And I would say actually is, I think, written to a higher level than the book that followed it. I'm not super animated about it. I ultimately found it forgettable, but it's the better of the two. And if you're interested in weird fiction or historic oddities, then To Walk the Night, I think, would probably be worth it. Planet of Adventure by Jack Vance, I'll also give a B. I just don't like it as much as the Dying Earth stuff, or as I remember the Dying Earth stuff, although it has also been a while. This is a big planetary romance, swashbuckling, almost sword and sorcery epic, constituting 4 books. Let's see if I can remember them. City of the Chosh, City of the Wank, City of the Noom, or is it just the Noom and then the Deer? I don't remember. But those are 4 races of alien, of hominid or humanoid. This is a sci-fi channel. Humanoid species that live on this planet Tschai that this human character from Earth crash lands on along with a co-pilot. The co-pilot is murdered in front of his eyes by weird aliens on hovercraft. And then he watches from a tree as his spaceship is captured and whisked away to parts unknown. And he's on this sort of Mongolian steppe where he runs into tribal alien people who worship these potent totems that give their wearers godlike abilities. And then this guy has to navigate his way out of being murdered by this tribe and then go out into the big bad world of Tschai and try to find his spacecraft. And over the course of that journey, unearths a lot of detail about these different alien species that cohabitate the world, that have different relationships to one another, and all of whom have subordinate pseudo/fully slave castes of humans, of like Homo sapiens, who have divergently evolved in subtle ways to resemble their master species. Overall, the world building is phenomenal. The writing itself occasionally sort of steps in potholes. Vance tries to do political satire, which he is, I hate to say it, not very good at. Like, Vance is a good writer, and we'll get to the writing itself because you always have to talk about the writing when you talk about Vance, but Vance as a political whatever, and this isn't me reading into it, if you read something like The Grey Prince or even like The Blue World, Vance definitely was a politically inflected writer, sort of like a Heinlein, at times as sort of didactic and on the nose as Heinlein, like in The Grey Prince. But there are flashes of that, especially in the first book, that I think leave kind of a sour taste. I just it didn't resonate with me very much, and I think it was distracting and slightly cheap. The final book, I didn't love that much, but there's a lot of episodes in it, these big high adventure, action, almost Star Wars-y type episodes that are really great. And the aliens themselves are great. The writing is good. It's not high Vance. I think Vance is, again, at his best, to my memory, in the Dying Earth stuff, where it has this elegiac, gorgeous, like beautiful sort of solemn tone. In here, it is much pulpier, less sort of ornamental, I think possibly to its detriment, but it's still very good because it's Vance, and Vance wrote like Vance. Sort of hard to describe if you haven't read him, but definitely like elevated, and his characters tend to speak in a very stilted, aristocratic way, and with a particularly aristocratic and strange vocabulary. it was a good reading experience because actually, when I was a kid, I had a copy of Barlow's Guide to Science Fiction, or Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials, and his treatments of the aliens in this were my favorite in that book. And I remember reading the synopses and thinking, wow, that sounds totally fascinating. And that's one of the germinal seeds of me getting into science fiction in the first place. And I always had these books in the back of my mind as I should really read these to fulfill that curiosity from when I was a kid. And so it was a neat experience closing that loop, but it's good, but it's not great. And I think that there's Vance stuff that is better than this. I would say Blue World, I think I like a little bit more than this. Blue World and Dying Earth, I think, are my favorite Vances. I may be forgetting something. Parable of the Sower by Butler. Damn, I'm really tempted to give it S, but I can't because it does certainly have flaws. It's a post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic story set in a near future where the United States has gone fascist and is suffering from environmental collapse and social collapse. People live in these walled enclaves surrounded by wastelands full of drug-addled barbarian, bands of savages who roam around rending and reaving and causing grievous bodily harm, and leading raiding parties into the little walled townships where people are desperately trying to hang on to their little, relic grasp on something like a middle-class existence where they still have to go into work. Work is essentially slavery, and corporations are making these company towns where they hire people with these predatory contracts where they're turned into indentured servants. And the book follows a protagonist who's a young girl who hatches this idea called the star seed, doesn't know where it comes from, but is seized with this new religious conviction of pursuing a future for humanity as a starfaring species, as a means to escape the planet and all of the planet's problems in its current stage of decay. The dystopian elements and the sort of like survival horror part of this are so effective and so frightening that I actually took up gardening after reading this book. I took up foraging first, which will make sense if you read it. That's a subplot. Because I realized, if things really go belly up, it would be nice to be able to identify edible plants so that I could survive. And then that turned into a gardening hobby. So this book genuinely sort of changed my life. It's one of the most hardcore, scariest, most violent, most brutal, most unflinching, uncompromising books that I've ever read. It's wild to me that it seems to be marketed to the YA readership. I thought, unfortunately, all the starseed stuff, I didn't care and I wasn't moved by it, and it just didn't seem to fit. I know that this is the first book in a series. Maybe it goes interesting places later, but it just felt really shoehorned in there. Everything else about it I thought was so good. I know that Butler is really popular, but I think that she should be taken a little bit more seriously. She tends to get pigeonholed a little bit, I think, and her work gets pigeonholed. I think that it would be a major mistake just to see her work as being feminist science fiction or science fiction that is about race. All the books that I've read from her meet those criteria, but all of them are also much more than that, including this one. I think that this is probably my favorite. The three that I've read, I love all of them. This one, Dawn, and Kindred are all incredibly good books. There's something about her writing style that I think makes her fairly normie friendly, I guess, or not prohibitive in the way that someone like Russ might be. But the sophistication of her books doesn't suffer from that relatively simple writing style, which is something that I don't say of a whole lot of writers. She's one of the rare few where I think that it does kind of work. My personal preference would be a little bit more embellishment on the prose front, but it is not something that I'm willing to count as a negative in her case, whereas with most people I probably would mention it as such. 10,000 Light Years from Home by Tiptree. I hate to say it. I really didn't like. These are her kind of also ran stories. None of her really well-known short stories are in this. And I think that these were also her earlier stories, and her later work is the stuff that she's most celebrated for as being really sophisticated in its themes and such. This I found both relatively sort of simplistic and also annoying, like smarmy. For some reason, the person that I pulled as the point of reference for the tone and why the tone irritated me was Heinlein. It just has this air of sort of like smugness and like smarminess and cleverness and sort of self-satisfaction in its own cleverness. I don't remember almost anything about the material itself. I just remember being really profoundly disappointed by this because I had high expectations and high hopes. Tiptree is someone that I want to read more of, and her biography is completely fascinating. But this material I just did not like. Beyond Tomorrow, I don't remember the name of the editor, but I liked this a lot for the most part. It is a short story compilation that includes a lot of material by Australian science fiction writers. And I regret to say most of the Australian, or all of the Australian stories I didn't care for. Not because they're Australian, but because they just were not good picks, I don't think. But this book has tons and tons of heavy-hitting writers in it. I had forgotten the Asimov intro. It's pretty funny because it's just Asimov talking about how great Isaac Asimov is. That's my memory. Lee Harding is the name of the editor. Harding is Australian. Lots of really good stuff in here. This is the standout, 9 Lives by Le Guin, one of the best pieces of science fiction I have ever read. This is, in fact, probably the best thing I've ever read from Le Guin. I don't even want to say anything about it because I don't want to spoil anything. It's such a good story. The writing is so, just read the first paragraph. This is also insane. Mother Hitten's Little Kittens by Cordwainer Smith. This is Smith writing in the same mode as he wrote Think Blue, Count 2, which is one of the nuttiest, most disturbing, bizarrely sort of dark things that I've read. Cordwainer Smith in his short work is typically pretty different than the Cordwainer Smith of Neustralia. This is a good example. Insanely like dark, surprisingly dark story. It's one of his most famous. I definitely recommend that one. And then I also recommend this one, The Garden of Time, short story by J.G. Ballard, which was apparently the inspiration for, what was it, the Met Gala or something a few years back. That's what it's remembered for now. I didn't know that reading it. Great story. Most of this stuff is really good. There's a few duds, but the like wheat to chaff ratio in this is much better than most compilations. Unfortunately, Orsinian Tales by Le Guin, which I read because of 9 Lives, is just not up to the same level as 9 Lives. This is the only Le Guin that I've read other than Earthsea that left me kind of tepid, and I think that I like Earthsea better than this. It's not fantasy stories, it's not science fiction stories, it's historical fiction / literary fiction that all takes place in Orsinia, which is a fictitious Eastern European country. They get a little bit formulaic. They're all these Romeo and Juliet stories of unrequited impossible loves. And there's one exception, which is the first story, which is where this misleading cover illustration comes from that I think is excellent. But other than that, I found it a little bit overwrought, surprisingly purple in spots, surprisingly sort of self-serious. And it didn't hit the mark for me. Maybe it's because I was primed to want Le Guin, but it was something else. I don't know. Fault Lines by Kate Wilhelm, I really like. This is another one that is arguably not science fiction. That's about an older woman who is trapped in the rubble of a San Francisco mansion that she owned that collapses on her after an earthquake. And as she is pinned under the rubble, she goes back through her life, experiencing episodes as pseudo-hallucinations and also falling asleep and dreaming about her past and her memory and her dreams sort of blending together, retreading this life lived as an iconoclastic, arts editor and patron of the arts who never married and was sort of ostracized or criticized, socially paid a high price for being, a woman who operated under her own agency and didn't compromise and didn't capitulate to the social pressure to marry. And it's just a very quiet, good character study that touches on the sciences and has the skeleton of a genre book, but it's arguably more lit fic than it is a genre book. But just another interesting sort of multifaceted, different color depending on which direction the light hits it sort of a book. I thought it was very strong, and Kate Wilhelm is a great character writer and a great prose writer. Another one who is not especially flashy or showy in her prose style, but it's full. It's sort of neutral without being empty in the way I feel a lot of modern prose is sort of hollow feeling. Chamiel by Pearson sucks. Has a really cool cover. It's a very boring piece of Christian fantasy. A lot of fantasy that I like is Christian fantasy. This is not an example of it. It's about a boy who is visited by an archangel throughout his life at different times, and the archangel tells him stories about a war between the forces of good and evil in a fantasy realm that is Middle-earth, and religious stuff happens. It is the kind of Christian fiction that I don't care for, and I thought that it was bad. Mostly because the writing is bad and the book is boring and entirely predictable. And I think it was a juvenile too, which I didn't know. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but it was just a confluence of factors that made me say, no thanks. Vermilion Sands by Ballard, I will give an A as well. I think that this would be a great sort of first Ballard. It gives you the flavor of both kinds of Ballard. Interestingly, there's both disaster novels, like the early disaster novels like The Drought. There's a lot of aesthetics from that period of Ballard in it, and there's also a certain foretaste of the urban disaster books that were to follow this one. It's about a resort town in a near future that's modeled off of Palm Springs, that is in the waning days of its popularity. Like Palm Springs, it was the playground of the stars, and there's this sort of holdover population of slightly older people that live there who remember the halcyon days and have affairs. That's most of the stories. This is a collection of short stories. Most of the stories revolve around a middle-aged white-collar male becoming infatuated with a mysterious witchy woman across the shifting sands of their respective apartment buildings. And that element of it I found a little bit eye-rolling at times, pretty formulaic, pretty predictable. Every Ballard book is about a doctor having an affair in the end times. Vermilion Sands is not necessarily an exception to that, although it's not all the same characters in all the stories. But there's also this incredibly, surprisingly bizarre extrusion of fabulation in what is supposed to be a relatively realistic future that is barely advanced past our own, where there are these organic crystalline structures that grow out in the desert that people take and turn into musical instruments that play their own music of the spheres. And there are these vast sand dune areas where different animals have evolved, like a flying stingray that hovers over the sands, and there are people on floating barges that go out to hunt them. Really weird mashup of different tropes, and it's sort of Ballard in a mood that is more frivolous and more playful than you get anywhere else in Ballard, and I have touched his corpus. Sure, that's a perfect way to talk about J.G. Ballard. I don't think that it reaches the level of his best stuff, but it's such an oddball. Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, by PKD, I was pleasantly surprised to really love. Why were you pleasantly surprised by a PKD book being good, Matt? A lot of them are not. It's about a celebrity television presenter who wakes up in a hotel room one day, doesn't remember how he got there, and nobody knows who he is. And the world outside the hotel is a police state. He has to find his way through this world without getting arrested and interrogated about his identity. And there are two different warring factions of police forces. And I think that this is Dick as people assume Dick to be. This is not Dick in his pulpier mode of just throwing a bunch of bullshit at the page and hoping that it coheres into something, and often it doesn't. This is Dick in the mind-bending, noir, cyberpunky mode that I think people associate him with, and that I think is him at his strongest. And certainly not a perfect book, but it is surprisingly sort of flinty and hard-edged and edgy for its time. It maintains that edginess. And it also reads like The Matrix. I think it's very good. Kill the Dead by Tanith Lee is just a great, this is what I want every fantasy book to be. Man, this is so good. I think that this might be my favorite Tanith Lee. I think this and Electric Forest have to be my two favorites, and this is my favorite of her fantasies. I think I like Kill the Dead even more than I do Knight's Master, even though I think that it's a less complicated book and technically less of an achievement. There's something about the character work in this that's just so good. And the fact that she was able to take a completely generic, I think it's meant to take place in Spain, like a medieval European fantasy setting with ghosts and goblins and, well, just ghosts, really. A mysterious man in black wandering the countryside, getting into adventures, that she took that incredibly straightforward, almost hackneyed, you could say, premise and do this incredible thing with it, I think recommends this book possibly as my favorite. It's about a ghost hunter named Parl Drought. It's a testament to how good the book is that I remember the characters' names in it. And a testament to how good the names are too. Parl Drought, such a good name for a dark, brooding man in black protagonist. Parl Drought wanders the countryside, listening to whispers on the wind and the talk of the villagers for clues of where he can find ghosts to dispatch, contrary to the wishes of the people who are still living, who maintain relationships with the ghosts and want to keep them around because they have sentimental attachments to the person in their memories of them while they were still alive. So people despise Parl Drought. He's a pariah. He comes into this village where he meets this minstrel guy in a tavern who ends up kind of following him around on his ghost hunting adventures. And it just unfolds into this amazingly good character study of the relationship between these two men and their backstories. A study of the relationship of their backstories to their personalities and to their troubles in life. It's a study of grief and pain. Amazing, classic, the thing that people want out of fantasy, of cool world building and exciting fantasy action, it's in there. Creates this whole cosmology in a short Daw book. And it's just gorgeous. It just has a Vancian feel, a Dying Earth feel. Tanith Lee is just so good. When Tanith Lee is good, she hits all the buttons. She just, scrapes her hand down the bank of floors on the elevator and you hit every single one. Every floor you could visit in genre fiction. It's like the prose is gorgeous and potent and meaningful without being overly complex or indulgent or impenetrable, things that sometimes I like but sometimes I don't. Her works are exciting. They just hit that lizard brain thing in sci-fi and fantasy of sometimes you just want cool spaceship, go zoom, shoot laser. Her sci-fi can do that. Her fantasy can do the thing of I want swords to go into torso of orc. Her fantasy can do that too. She really, I think is in a category with very few peers on that front, where she does science fiction that you could look at from a particular angle. In fantasy, you could look at it from a particular angle and say, that's just pulp or that's just sword and sorcery, but it's more. It has this whole back end implicit in it that's, that elevates it to something greater than just pulp. I love her, as you can tell. Kalimantan by Lucius Shepard. Yeah, we'll give it a C. No, we'll bump it up to a B because I'm going to include the 2 short stories that were bundled with this novella called Kalimantan along with this. The 2 short stories, Solitario's Eyes and the Aravicello, I think are the names of them, are really, really good. Solitario's Eyes is straight magical realism about a sad man on a beach. The other one is a far future sci-fi, weird, like hothouse type story about a jungle that creates a hominid mimic man with superpowers to infiltrate like a human colony of spacefaring humans that's like clear-cutting the forest. So it's like weird sort of almost Hyperion-esque Fern Gully thing. Super good. I love those 2 stories. Kalimantan, the novella, not as good. It's Joseph Conrad type, a Heart of Darkness type thing about this guy who lives on Borneo. Kalimantan is an old name for Borneo. Who, like this young American guy who gets himself in hot water with some political factions on the islands, flees to the aid of a middle-aged British shopkeeper in town who's also tapped into the underworld, who secrets him away to a hut in the jungle far away where an old Danish man lives. And the 2 of them study, especially the young American study, this psychoactive plant compound that renders hallucinations that may be able to influence the physical world around them. And it's sort of like a weirdly racist cautionary tale about Western powers dabbling in like the dark forces of the Far Orient, and how I think the implication is like the Asian world is dangerous and unknowable in a way that it just like, it shouldn't be tampered with or something. It's just like, there was enough in there like that to just turn me off of the book. And the novel itself is not really that good. The novella itself is really not that strong. Not structured very well. I found it both pretentious and annoying and boring. Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. Unfortunately, I also didn't care for. It's a novella about a girl from the Himba tribe in Namibia who is the first of her people to be invited to study at this galactic university that's on an alien world. And in transit, she is a fish out of water among other people who look down upon her because she wears the Himba, the orange clay that they put in their hair and they put on their skin. She feels conscience-stricken because she has left her people behind on Earth. And en route, something bad happens and she has to survive. Don't want to spoil more than that. If you read the back of the book, it probably spoils it. But the book is like 100 pages long or something. So in the event that you're going to read it, it's like the one surprising thing that happens in the book. I don't want to take that away from you. Unfortunately, the writing just wasn't that good. I think thematically it's interesting. If memory serves, Nnedi Okorafor refers to her work as African futurism as something distinct from Afrofuturism. She claims that it wasn't YA. It reads as if it were. I found the writing poor, overly simplistic. I found the plot just a little too generic. It's like generic pulp sci-fi stuff. I think that it just should have been like longer, which is not typically the note that I give about recent science fiction, but it's too short. I seem to recall a lot of really clumsy exposition also. I think if she had just like slowed down, spent more time in character work, spent more time kind of, as they say, showing and not telling, it would have been a decent book. The Anything Box by Zena Henderson. Boy, did I find this boring. Science fiction, fantasy, horror short stories that tend to blur the edges between the genres are mostly about children, are mostly about restoration of the sense of wonder, mostly stories about the power of the imagination and a recurrent structure of a middle-aged female adult character tutoring or mentoring a young child. Senna Henderson was a school teacher as well, and I didn't really care, is the thing. Some of these stories are pretty bad. Walking Aunt Dade is the one that I remember as being the best. It's about a family that has a zombie in it. It's good. It's actually pretty creepy. The rest of these I barely remember. I do remember The Grunder being very stupid. You Sane Men by Lawrence Janifer is the original title of Blood World. I thought that this would be like a Thomas Burnett Swan comedic relief kind of a book to read, a palate cleanser. I was very surprised by this book. It's about this nominally benevolent, liberal, intergalactic civilization, sort of like Starfleet in Star Trek, or the Hainish, whatever the Hainish is, whatever noun. There's a faction that secedes and they colonize this planet so that they can pursue their personal liberty to construct a perfect society around principles of controlled recreational torture of a slave class of people called the Bound, who live in these basically underground warrens underneath these pseudo brothels called remand houses, where the aristocrats can go and rent out rooms, rent out individuals to enact their darkest impulses upon in order to get the evil out so that they can be rational statesmen. And one of these aristocrats ends up falling in love with a bound woman. There's a culture clash between the old guard of the older aristocrats and their children, who start getting notions about wanting to usurp their parents' power. And then eventually this leads to a culture clash, a broader culture clash between this planet culture and the host civilization that it broke away from, in which the protagonist addresses a committee of people who are interrogating him, who he refers to sardonically as you sane men, confronting them with the sorts of regulatory violence that they commit behind the scenes, whereas this society on this barbarian planet that's perceived of as barbaric by this committee is open about state violence and their monopoly on violence and how they wield it on behalf of control. Fascinating book. It's not super well written. Janifer tends to get redundant. Janifer tends to write overlong sentences and overlong paragraphs. The pacing isn't always great, but there's just a level of thematic sophistication and craftsmanship in this that totally knocked the wind out of me. I was not expecting it whatsoever. It's also surprisingly tasteful. That synopsis probably turned a lot of you off, but it's sort of like Shadow of the Torturer, but a little bit less graphic. It's equally as emotionally impactful, I would say, as the subplot between Severian and Thekla, which is one of my favorite parts of Book of the New Sun. One of the parts of Book of the New Sun that I just kind of like and enjoyed in an unqualified way. Has strong flavors of that, but it's less graphically violent. It's a little bit less disturbing. It also doesn't necessarily go to the extremes that you might think that it would. There's also an interesting level of commentary implied about political authority inherently being like paternalistic, or the role of the state being inherently paternalistic and seeing its subjects as children. I just wasn't expecting this whatsoever, and I ended up thinking of it kind of in the same breath as Le Guin. It's really complex, and despite its flaws, I think that if this had been written by someone who wasn't considered a hack, which Janifer was and is, I think that this would probably be a famous book, I will say, or at least a much better known book. Unfortunately, this Janifer is bad. I was so hyped up on this one that I went and read the other Janifer that I had on hand, and this is just really hackneyed, on the nose, Cold War era, political satire, sci-fi, romp, farce. Bad. I think the most charitable thing that I could say about it is that it kind of reminded me of Hard to Be a God by the Strugatskys, but it's just, I don't know, it's bad, it sucks. Real-Time World by Priest, I liked a lot. This is his first collection of short stories. It's the first short stories I've read. The only other Priest that I've read is Inverted World. This is very different. It's not as good, but it's less hard SF-y. Some of it is pulpy, space opera-y stuff that I didn't think was very good. Some of it's extremely weird. Some of it reads just like Ballard, to the point where it's almost impossible even to explain or describe. And then some of it's really dark. Some of it is really pissed off. That's my favorite material from this. My favorite story from this is called Firestorm. That's essentially about drone warfare. It's about this guy who turns the destruction of a city into its own art form in his own mind, where he's the commander of a besieging military force after all the people, or most of the people, have been evacuated out of the city. He is under orders to preserve the functioning of the city and all the infrastructure of the city as well as he can until such time as he receives the order to destroy it. He gets the order and then he goes up in this big ship and orchestrates this complete and utter annihilation of the thing that he was spending so much time cultivating and protecting. And I think it's just a profound story. I'm surprised it's not better known. I'm surprised it's not more well-liked by people who read the book who, as far as I can tell, don't consider it one of even the major works in this book, but I think it's one of my favorite short stories that I've ever read. Billion Year Spree by Algis, I like a lot. I do not agree with all of his takes. It's his history of science fiction told in large part through this rhetorical lens of there being kind of a split into two camps in science fiction, what he calls the dreaming pole and the thinking pole. Dreaming pole really representing weird fiction and a lot of pulp fiction, and the thinking pole representing hard SF. I like that all this gets up to his elbows in the political blood and guts in science fiction and portrays it as being a fundamentally kind of, in large part, ideologically driven genre, which I think that it is. I think that he's very fair and even-handed, and Algis is a great writer. This was updated later with like some extra DLC written, I think not by Algis actually, as Trillion Year Spree, but this is the core text, as they say. It's very good. The Sheep Look Up by Brunner is good. It's the book that brought us Peter Watts' literary career, so we definitely have that to thank for it. It's written in a way that makes it very difficult to get a flow going, which is a challenge because it's 8 million pages long. I think it should be commended for going much harder in the paint than really anyone that I can think of except maybe Thomas Dish went during that period of just a vision of complete collapse. It reminded me a lot of Parable of the Sower, a book that I clearly prefer a little bit. But it's that level of, oh shit, just everything is ruined forever, permanently, and there's nothing that we can really do. It's about climate collapse and climate collapse's effect on human society and human politics. But interestingly, it was written in the pre-climate change, pre-global warming era when people just understood these issues as pollution. So you get a lot of like Captain Planet sort of aesthetics, people in gas masks and big barrels of toxic sludge everywhere and stuff. It's a good book. It is bloated. There are too many characters. I found most of the characters sort of dull, and his pseudo-modernist writing style that is a bit like, or more than a bit like, Stand on Zanzibar, but toned down just a little bit. Still, it's experimental enough to kind of make those sandals nice and gritty, but it's a respectable book. I respect it. I respect Brunner. And in a lot of senses, it's aged well. Doomsday Morning by C.L. Moore, I like a lot. It's her last book. It's one of the few that she wrote without any input from Henry Kuttner. It's the only C.L. Moore standalone thing that I've read. I've read C.L. Moore before because I've read Fury by Kuttner that she partially co-wrote, although it was mostly Kuttner. This is really good, really good. It reminds me of Fury, go figure. It reminds me of Bester in the way that he wrote male characters. The protagonist in this is a very Besterian, very Fury-ish, sort of hard-ass, hard-drinking, almost sort of pulp crime fiction protagonist. Like this guy who used to be a movie star, fell out of favor, experienced some kind of public disgrace. His wife, who was also his co-star, died. And he took to the bottle, signed a contract to be an indentured servant in a near future to a corporation, and then is offered a shot at getting out of the contract and getting his old life back if he will help the government monkey wrench attempts in California, which is a breakaway autonomous state that has seceded from the United States. If he will infiltrate with a theater troupe to run some kind of psyop in California to gather information about a secret weapon they're developing to defeat a computer surveillance system called COMUS, C-O-M-U-S, that controls life outside of California for the rest of the country. Super good book. There's a lot of Vin Diesel-y, a lot of action movie-y sequences, stuff blowing up, whatever. That stuff's fine. It wasn't really my particular cup of tea. The study of the protagonist and the character studies of the other members of his little theater troupe are superb. I think that Moore was at least as good of a writer as Kuttner, at least as good of a writer as Bester, certainly on the front of characterization and just on a prose level, although I think Bester's sort of explosive inventiveness and weirdness is pretty hard to mimic, hard to distill. But Moore, I think, was a very, very strong and very competent and sort of understated prose writer, and she wrote characters that I think were better than Bester or Kuttner. Kuttner is failing the name test. Bester, I remember Gullyfoyle. And I don't remember this guy's name, so I guess the test is useless. But it's all the stuff that isn't sci-fi in here that's really interesting. Other Worlds, Other Seas by Darko Suvin, I will give a C. The most interesting thing in here is Suvin's intro, which is a response to an essay that Asimov wrote that was the introduction to his Soviet science fiction compilation, where Suvin is criticizing his schema as the history of science fiction being able to be broken up into three stages. First of adventure fiction, then of technology fiction, and then as social fiction. And then Suvin posits there's a fourth, which is utopian fiction, specifically socialist science fiction. And it's an interesting essay. It's a little bit snide when it comes to Asimov, but my last name is Asimov, so who really cares? But the material, which is science fiction stories with an alleged utopian character or perspective from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, just weren't really that good. The final story by Dniprov, The Island of the Crabs, is good. It's about machine evolution. Reminded me of Island of Dr. Moreau. That's a very good story and very interesting. The rest of it I could kind of take or leave. The Many Worlds of Barry Malzberg. If I'm being objective, I have to give an A, even though I really like it because there were a couple of stories in here that I didn't think were Malzberg at his strongest. It includes Final War, which is a pretty famous story from him. I just didn't think that it was Malzberg at his best. A lot of this stuff I felt that way. There are, however, stories in here that reminded me very much of this sort of Malzberg in his most politically paranoiac and crazy, which is one of the things that I like in Malzberg, that particular kind of craziness. It's also the first short story collection of his that I've read. This one includes the short story that was turned into this. I still think the novel is a little bit better. It's very interesting that in short form, you don't get a more concise or a more focused Malzberg. Not like all of his novels are just grabbing shit out of the air and just doing a Jackson Pollock painting and just saying whatever's on his mind. They're more streamlined, they're more pointed than maybe they seem a lot of the time. But it's the same Malzberg in the short stories. It's the same sort of frenetic, chaotic Malzberg writing style, and a lot of it at least. There's a couple that were a little bit more something that you would expect to read in analog or something, but a lot of this is equally as weird and equally as Malzbergian as his long-form writing, which is to its credit. New Worlds 3 is okay. God, I don't remember very much about this. I remember this one by Algis being annoying. This is about LSD. Could go the rest of my life without reading any more science fiction about LSD, maybe except for Son of Man by Silverberg, which I want to read. This one was really good, Disaster Story by Charles Platt. Not an author who's typically, I think, considered, whoa, just so big lightning strike. I'm in Puerto Vallarta at the moment, and there's thunderstorms about half of the nights. Some of them are just amazingly intense. Sounds like bombs going off outside. Really amazing. Anyway, I guess the gods command you to read Charles Platt. He's another guy, I think he's also in that Malzberg compilation of underrated writers, but he's not someone that I see brought up very much. Someone on the Patreon got mad at me because I had a negative opinion on this, and they had a pretty well-reasoned riposte to that of why I was wrong. That's one of the Patreon perks. If you get mad at me on Patreon, I will actually pay attention. So I could have been wrong about that one. Kazoo by James Salas. Contender up there with Last Hurrah of the Golden Horde by Spinrad for the most annoying short story I've ever read. They share a lot in common. Integrity by Barrington Bailey under his pen name P.F. Woods. I remember as being the best one. I don't remember anything about it. You're welcome. And then The Mountain by Moorcock, writing as James Colvin, is also good. I remember reading this previously. It's about two men tracking what they think is the last surviving human female in the world across, I think, Scandinavian mountainscape. Very strange story, good story. Fruit of the Gods by Wells, I'll also put at A. It doesn't make it to S just because it's such a jumble. It just doesn't flow like the other H.G. Wells novels do. God, do I have to bump? Yeah, I have to bump this one up to S now. Congrats, H. Fruit of the Gods, it just doesn't have a lot of flow. It feels like a messy book, but it does a lot. It's an impressive book, despite the fact that I didn't really like it that much in the first part, which is more of a comedy. It's about two scientists who invent this compound that causes living things that it comes into contact with to grow exponentially without an upper ceiling on growth. So a rat that's exposed to it grows to the size of a dog and starts killing people, or multiple rats. So this causes havoc. It feels just like reading a John Wyndham novel. Obviously, this came before John Wyndham. And then it just goes to different places. It's a book that is commentary about the nature of scientific discovery and the intersection between scientific innovation, technology, and social change, and also the moral role of the scientist, also the cult of celebrity that can form around science and scientists, and how that can influence public opinion and all of these things. Really surprisingly, again, contemporary and sophisticated. I think it's definitely worth reading and getting through the boring bits. To the end, the last bit, the last third of the book is just extremely strong. I was really impressed by it. And I think that this book deserves to be more famous. Obviously, it's a famous book. I would say there are no not famous H.G. Wells books, but that's definitely not the case. He has a huge bibliography, most of which is completely invisible in like the canon. The canon. A lot of it is not science fiction. A lot of it is just social novels or political essays. But a lot of it is science fiction, and it's just disregarded. It has a bad reputation of not being up to this level, but that's a long way of saying Fruit of the Gods probably should be considered in the same breath along with Moreau or Invisible Man or even the big two. Moonpool by Merritt, I did not like. This is his most famous book. It's also his first. It was serialized, let's just guess, Weird Tales. Let's go out on a limb and say it was serialized in Weird Tales. It might have been Argosy, actually. It's weird fiction in the Lovecraft vein. Imagine Lovecraft if Lovecraft really couldn't write at all. That's probably harsh. I will phrase it like this. It's Lovecraft, but written about 50% as well, and I'm not a big lover of Lovecraft. It's crazy long. I don't remember much about the plot. It's about a lost Atlantean civilization. There's a bunch of weird frog guys and other kinds of guys, and they go down in the underground, and the stuff happens with the guys, and there's lots of exclamation points. The little gopher in my brain has kicked most of this book out of the burrow. I just don't have much in the brain pan in reference to the moon pool. I just remember being intensely bored and annoyed by it. I guess his later books were supposed to be a lot better. Beasts by Crowley is so good. And it's nuts because this is considered one of Crowley's also ran books. It's the second novel he ever published. And he's best known for Little Big, which I haven't read. This is the only Crowley that I've read. I read it with Sean of SF Ultra. We recorded an episode about it that I encourage you to go listen to. I'll put a link to that in the description. It's free to listen to. And Sean and I both really loved the book. It's another book that's about like 8 different things all at once. It takes place in a near future United States that has suffered through another civil war. It's balkanized into different regional political entities, but the remnant federal government in Washington is trying to reassert its authority. There is a sort of Cordwainer Smithian underpeople called Leos, who are human beings who have been genetically hybridized with lions, who more closely resemble lions than human beings, except for the fact that they're bipedal and they can speak. They're considered unpeople. They're not afforded civil rights. And the Fed is launching a program to try to isolate them onto reservations. The Leos have a leader named Painter, who's this laconic figure who leads a resistance with the help of this trickster fox man. It's a book about history. It's a book about ethics. It's a book about animal consciousness, like the portrayal. I think my favorite part of it is just the portrayal of what animal consciousness is like. I found intensely compelling and believable. I think this is one of the most impressive, one of the most sophisticated, and one of the most potently written pieces of science fiction that I've ever read. I don't know that I would put it in a top 15, but it's bumping up against the lower end of top 15 status. There's a couple of pretty major blemishes in there. Again, like there's some sexual territory covered in there that is intensely uncomfortable. It's totally wild to me that this is not a more widely read book. Really recommend you listen to the episode. Sean loved it, I think even more than I did. I'm going to pitch you very briefly on the Patreon before signing off. I'm going to make it relatively painless. I've been reading a lot, and I've been reading more contemporary stuff. A lot of the titles that people have been entreating me to read for a long time. I just put up a review of Children of Time by Tchaikovsky on the Patreon. I read There Is No Anti-Memetics Division. So if you've been hungering after the book pill take on those books, those are up there. I've also been reading a lot of like slipstream and literary fiction that's more contemporary. So if you're one of the people who it bothers that I read mostly vintage stuff, see the Patreon. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you there or won't. And may your sandals be always unsandy. Cheers.